Hi, my name is Eric, and I'm going to talk to you today about some research done by myself and my colleague Chris Creighton. We are both on faculty at universities in Japan, and we are examining how to help high school students learn how to form international collaborative networks. Uh, Briefly, here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Uh, the main problem we're examining and trying to work on is Japanese researcher participation in international science. We'll start with kind of a background of that problem, and then we'll go into sort of how we view science as a social system versus a method, and then look at how Japanese universities function and some of the issues they have with globalization. Then we'll look at Japanese policies on education and globalization, examine how some international exchange programs work, and then talk about something from my field, social skills training. That's all to inform our actual research, where we look at how to help train students to understand and appreciate international work and how to form collaborative networks and why that's important to science, and hopefully give them some skills to do that. So of course we'll talk about our methods, the results, our discussion, and things we'd like to do in the future. Okay, so the problem, the prominence of Japanese scientific research internationally. In Japan over the last 10 years, there's often these waves of concerns about being international or not being international or globalizing. Um, you often hear the term kokusaika, which is internationalization, and there's different models of it. But it's kind of a big uniting theme. The Tokyo 2020 Olympics were supposed to be a grand showcase once again of Japan's global efforts and leadership in the world, much the way the 1964 Olympics were to showcase Japan's rising from the ashes of World War II. Tokyo 2020 was supposed to show how Japan had been able to overcome the disaster in 2011, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident, and show that Japan had reformed itself and was ready to take on the world again. However, looking at real data from 2020, when we think about internationalization and science, or just intellectualism overall, only 2 Japanese universities rank in the world 100, top 100. University of Tokyo and Kyoto University. Right? And these are the most prestigious schools in Japan. They are the Harvard, the Cambridge, the Oxford, the Sorbonne. These are the best schools in Japan, the most prestigious schools. Now, this scale that is used to find out these international rankings, one key component, I think there were 4, but one of them is international outlook. It looks at the proportion of international students and staff and the proportion of journal citations with one international co-author, at least one. This creates a scaled score from 0 to 100. Of course, 100 being, I guess, perfect international outlook. I don't know how you would say that. However, let's look at this fun donut. Lots of colors. Whoops, let's go back. There we go. Better not touch the screen again, huh? Okay, so 34% are in the top, are above a score of 90. So that's 34% of the top 100 schools. The top 100 schools in the world, 34% have a score of over 90 for international outlook. If you look at the red, blue, and gray, that all adds up to a bit over 50%. These are all the schools with a score over 70. Okay, so over half of schools in the top 100 have an international outlook score of over 70. If you look at scores over 60, that goes all the way up to about 85%. So in the top 100, 85% of schools have an international outlook of over 50. How does that relate to Japan? Let's see. If we look here, okay, Tokyo and Kyoto University both have a score of under 40. Under 40. Only one Japanese school is over the score of 60. Remember, 60 was, what was that, 85% of schools. So in the top 85 of the top 100 schools, 85% had over a score of 60. Only the University of Aizu fits that. And the next four highest rankings are all just barely in the 40s. Okay. Now these schools, their overall ranking, as you can see, is not in the top 100. In fact, Sophia University is kind of in the bottom, not even in the top 1,000. But for internationalism, they're ranked quite high. So why is this important? It's important because science, of course, is a method of knowledge creation, but it's also a social system. There's a network of scientists around the world, researchers working together to find out something new, to produce knowledge. And then there are networks of conferences and journals and papers, and then blogs and what else all over the place these days to produce knowledge and get it spread out across the world. Okay. And looking at that a bit more concretely, one Pediatrics Journal, in a review of all their papers, they found that the average number of authors per paper was a little less than 5. I think it was 4.8. And even in the letters section, the letters, which my image of the guy who writes letters is, a researcher on a Saturday night who's got this idea in his head and he just writes it out, sends it in to the journal. But those actually usually have 3 authors. Okay, so even the letters section has collaboration. Right, collaboration. Right. One article from Brazilian authors about Brazilian authors publishing highly cited research papers. Approximately 84% of them had international co-authors. And looking at all papers published by Brazilian authors, 37% involved international collaboration. And as we think about international collaboration, what is the language of knowledge of science? English. Right? In the Scopus database, 80% of all English articles are in English. If you look at the ratio of articles in English versus native language articles, even the most native-centric countries, not meaning nationalistic countries, but meaning the countries that publish the most in their own language, Germany, France, Spain, the ratio of English to native language publications is 5-1. And you look a little bit deeper, a lot of this is really in the humanities and social sciences. The hard sciences are dominated by English. So international collaboration, English language. Okay. So we now know that's important. International collaboration for science is important. How does Japan fit into it? Well, there's some barriers for Japan becoming part of this globalized knowledge creation system. Language barriers. Japanese is incredibly difficult to master. It's incredibly difficult for Japanese people to master English. As an English speaker, if I want to learn French or Spanish, I need about 1,000 hours of study, maybe 800. If I want to learn Japanese, I need 5 to 6,000 hours of study to become somewhat fluent. So it's an incredibly difficult language to learn. And so on the flip side, it's very difficult for them to learn English. Uh, on top of that, the way English is taught in Japan, it's usually taught by Japanese people who have been taught grammar, and they're really training people to be able to translate written English into Japanese, and in some instances, Japanese to English. But the goal is to be able to read English and perhaps translate that into Japanese. So entrance exams are built around that model. Teaching is built around that model. And really the only measurements most people will have of English will be, can they get into a university and then pass an exam like ACHN or TOEIC or perhaps TOEFL if they want to go overseas. The fact that there's so little English in their society also makes it difficult for foreign faculty to come to Japan. Finding paperwork in English that's readable by foreign faculty is a huge barrier. Students don't speak English. Lots of other faculty members don't speak English. So it's really just really difficult for foreigners to come to Japan and participate in Japanese academia, and it's also difficult for Japanese people to participate in international collaborations done in English. Right. On top of that, Japanese universities traditionally, and this is changing, have this sort of guild-like approach to academia, where your undergraduate students become your graduate students, become your doctoral students, and then get a job either at the same university or to a very closely related university. Very different than the model I experienced in America, where your graduate degree should come from a different place than your undergraduate degree, and you should get a job in a different school. So you should have experience in 3 schools by the time you're a professional academic. Right? And then another one that's more of a time and money constraint is international conferences. That June and July conference season is difficult for Japanese faculty because that is second quarter, the second half of the first semester, and everybody is very busy with teaching classes. Okay. And then there's a lot of sociocultural issues around globalizing Japan and their knowledge systems. Background knowledge can be different from North American, European versus Japanese. They have a different cultural approaches to learning, much more teacher-centered, lots of memorization, which students are amazing at, blows me away. But critical thinking skills are not as important, and that's not really taught. That can be really hard for teachers coming to Japan to try and overcome. In a country that's 98% Japanese, intercultural competency is very, very, very low. If I have a first-year university student and I can get them to come to my office and have a cup of coffee, that may be the first time they've ever sat and talked to somebody that's not from Japan. On top of that, there's also, especially in the way that Japanese language is constructed and the cultural rules that they follow, communication strategies can be very different, and this impacts communication all the time. I have problems with it. Instead of the individualistic expressing myself, my opinions clearly so other people can understand me, Japanese is much more collectivist, and the expectation is that we are all striving to work together and create harmony and make each other feel as good as possible about that. All right, so how do you address this? One way is through international exchange programs. And there's 4 main big divisions. 3 of them aren't really so important for our project today. What we're looking at is the promotion of short-term study abroad, as opposed to going to another country and learning a skill such as farming and then bringing it back to your country, or going to a foreign university and learning science and bringing that back. We're focusing on short-term study abroad. These are the most popular form of international exchange in Japan, usually a few weeks long, involve going overseas and staying in doing a homestay, staying with a family, taking some English in the morning, having the afternoons for cultural adventures like shopping and sightseeing and cultural events. And in Japan, these are usually organized by travel agencies. But once again, because of the language difficulties, most universities don't have the language ability to make connections and form those kinds of relationships. It really takes a travel agency in Japan to take care of it. And these are great programs for somebody who doesn't know anything at all about foreign cultures, never talked to a non-Japanese person. It's good for the first step of what sometimes in the field is called the flags, festivals, and food part of international exchange, like getting those sort of surface level appreciation of other cultures done. Okay. So how does that fit in with Japanese policy? Japanese policy is trying to figure out, we've got these exchange programs, we need better English ability, our high school students need more experience with science. How does all this fit together? So one policy started about 20 years ago is the Super Science High School. And here you have high schools where traditionally students did a little bit of lab work, but really more memorization about science for entrance exams. This program sought to form relationships between universities and high schools, this policy, and then to increase access for fieldwork laboratories and professional researchers for high school students, to get students more excited about science and get them more prepared to engage in science when they get to university. Sort of parallel to this, about 10 years later, was the Super Global High School program. And this kind of as a separate track looked to support the development of English communication skills, critical thinking, and help students develop a globalist perspective on social and economic issues. But they're still sort of different silos. And then another piece of this is, how do you overcome some of the communication issues of helping Japanese students interface to form relationships with other cultures and other people? So in the EFL world, the skills taught are reading, writing, listening, speaking, with grammar, and vocabulary. That's the communicative approach to teaching skills. Now, where I come from, my field, social work, we think more about how do you help people learn to have healthy relationships through role play, discussion, and problem solving together. How do you help them learn to have more effective communication? How do you teach them to be assertive without being aggressive? How to manage shyness or anxiety about meeting new people? So in one sense, we're looking at kind of fusing these two models together somehow, which brings us to our hypothesis. We were thinking that if we can get students going on an international exchange, one of these science exchanges, to really focus on social skills as opposed to English survival skills, and to get them fascinated with the idea of making friends with other kids who like science, that they would have a better chance of making friends, of forming their own collaborative networks, a skill which is important in the 21st century world of science. Okay. We looked at quantitative and qualitative data, so it's mixed methods, and we had two groups, but of course we couldn't do random assignment, and the groups were somewhat not related, so it's quasi-experimental. It's not as experimental as we would like, but yeah, it's pretty good. We had 2 programs to compare, STEM programs. Okay. In our control group, this would be like a very traditional high school student exchange program with science added into it. There were 19 participants in our control group. They went to Europe, a native English-speaking country. And while there, they did study some English, and they also did site visits. They did projects with foreign students, attended lectures, and had a Q&A session with a researcher at the end. Before they left, there was also these pre-departure orientation classes, 3 of them, 5-hour English classes, and these taught survival English. How do you talk to your homestay family about food and using the bath or needing more soap, something like that, or problems in the airport or how to go shopping, kind of the survival English kind of level. The experimental group, we did something quite different. While they still went to Europe, they went to non-native speaking European countries. So it was an EFL environment, not a native English environment. So that was different. And then we designed a social skills module. Instead of the pre-orientation session, we had a social skills module for them that looks at network analysis, collaborative networks, and that kind of thing. Let's get more into detail there. In the social skills module, there are 4 main parts. First, we just did some knowledge building around the social construction of science and the importance of transnational collaborative networks. A bit more than what I talked about earlier in the introduction, but kind of the same sort of thing. Then we also did a small social network analysis project with them, in which we had the students look at everybody in Europe and in Japan that was involved with the project and their project teams, and look at who they were sending line messages to, SNS messages, who they were emailing, who they were having face-to-face conversations with. And we compiled all that together from everyone and made a big network of everybody together. And we talked about metrics like centrality and betweenness centrality and eigenvalue centrality and what those differences meant, and use Gephi, so we made lots of nice colors and different colored lines and shapes, and to help them visualize what their collaborative networks looked like and how it was important and how to think about how to talk to each other. Okay, which leads into the 3rd part, group discussions and problem solving around how do you interact with other researchers, right? How do you show interest when somebody's talking, or when is it appropriate to ask questions, and how do you share opinions, and when's a good time, and doing it over face-to-face. So there's some things it's better to talk about face-to-face versus asynchronous communication like messages or email. Is it better? When is email better than SNS? Right? So how to use media effectively. And then they also had some online introductions and pre-travel project work with the European students. So everybody got to meet and talk online, work with their partners, and yeah. So that was sort of how that went versus the pre-orientation survival English system. Okay. The data we analyzed, we had post-program reports written by the students. In Japan, this is really normal. When students finish some kind of field trip, they come back to class and they write a page or 2 about the experience, and it's very intuitive, meaning they can write whatever they want. There's not a lot of prompting from the teachers. It's a chance for them to roll around in their heads and what they felt about things and to try and put it all together somehow. So we had those kinds of post-program reports. We had instructor observations from the faculty that went with them overseas. And then we also had, from the experimental group only, unfortunately, a video of their question and answer session with the researchers on the last day, the professional researchers. So from that data, Chris, who's not in the video, but who did lots of great work with this data analysis, he used Voyant tools to analyze the text. He did a word count to find out which words occurred the most, and then he used Fisher's exact test to see if there was any significant difference in on the frequency of usage of the words between the control and experimental group. And then after that, we used a qualitative analysis to look at the context around the important words used to find out if those words were used differently by the two groups. So of looking at different keywords, the four that really popped up a lot were field trip, English, research, and questions. Okay. Now, of course, the control group had twice as many students as the experimental group, so you would expect a higher frequency of word usage. And looking at field trip in English, it's about double. So okay, that makes sense. Nothing really surprising there. They both used about the same number of times and about at the same rate per student. The interesting one is research and questions. Now, although the control group had twice as many students, the experimental group mentioned both research and questions 3 times as often. All right, so that's really interesting that these two words came out differently. Unfortunately, it looked like only the research was significantly different, probably because the frequency was a bit higher. Of course, the frequencies are so low, it's really hard to say if there really is a difference anyway because of just the variation. But anyway, research and questions were the happily surprising difference. Okay, so we did some extra context look at the word research, and what we found here that was interesting was that the control group mentioned research in terms of going to the STEM lectures and listening and being at their homestay and I guess talking about it with their families. We listened to some lectures on research today, that kind of thing. And they talked a lot about other people's research. Now the cool part with the experimental group is when they talked about research, they were talking about their own research projects that they participated in. That's what they were focused on in their post-program reports, their research projects. And they talked a lot about international collaboration, working with their partners on their research, right? So it's really great, they we think because of the extra training module, they really appreciated the international collaboration aspect and enjoyed doing this science, and that was really nice to see that came out. The other big difference was the question and answer behaviors during the STEM lectures, especially both of these projects culminate in a final day where a scientist would give a lecture on the importance of science and different kinds of research and things related to what they were looking at on their trips. The control group, nobody asked any questions at the end after the lecture. They did not interact with the speaker at all, and from what data we could find, it looked like one person said that they just didn't know how to ask. They didn't know how to interact with the speaker. Okay, this is completely different than the experimental group. 9 out of 10 students asked questions, and they had questions that focused on technology, the topic of management of water resources, and just about the different designs. And it was just really nice to see the students excited and interacting, right, as opposed to sitting and passively wondering what they're supposed to do next. So overall, we would say that there was a benefit to this extra social skills module that we did for the students. So basically, we believe that at least Japanese EFL students benefit from getting explicit instructions about the importance of collaboration, especially in the field of science, and that science isn't just a methodology, it's people working together to answer cool and interesting questions and help them think about and practice the communication skills they need, and to help them think about the larger networks that they're participating in and where they want to be in those networks, and how to help form those networks from a more objective stance instead of this sort of intuitive drive of like, I should probably talk to somebody, but I feel nervous, versus I need to have a lot of communication with these three people to make sure this thing happens. Okay. The other part is that we think is important is that you could inject this into like short-term intensive study abroad programs, as having these extra social skills trainings about communication, about how to make friends, about how to manage anxiety, about appropriate ways to ask questions, about how to be assertive to get what you need without being obnoxious or being too aggressive. We think these would be useful skills to include into EFL classes. Okay. Which brings us to what we're hopefully going to start looking at this year next, is how to really build a curriculum, a social skills curriculum similar to what I would use working with like youth with behavioral problems. Are there ways to take some of those workbooks with social skills, role plays, and problem solving and group discussion, and incorporate that into EFL materials? And then the next part is when working with science students, to using social network analysis and talking about social networks and collaborative networks to come up with some ways to help science students better understand that, yes, they need to learn how to, they need to learn their calculus and statistics, and they need to learn all the other hard science stuff, which I'm very sorry I don't know much about. But there isn't just that piece. There's also the piece where they go out and they talk with other cool people talking about their cool science things and get excited and make friends and come up with new ideas and test those ideas out together. And that is also a part of science, and it's very, very important. So that is it for today for our lecture. Thank you very much for watching this video. I really wish that we were meeting in person. So hopefully in the Q&A sessions online we can talk, and maybe sometime in the future we'll be able to meet at another NetGlow conference. Thank you.